Do you argue more about the issue, or do you argue more about how to communicate the issue? Today on the Roundtable Perspective, Dr. Michaela Winchatz joins me in examining the ethnography of communication. One of the things we discuss is how media personalities negotiate what they can and cannot talk about when they're on the air. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined by my guest, Dr. Michaela Winchatz. Dr. Winchatz has a speech communication Ph.D. from the University of Washington in Seattle, and her area of research is ethnography and communication. Welcome, Dr. Winchatz.
Thank you.
Good to have you here. You have an article that's coming out recently called Policing the Boundaries of the Sayable, the Public Negotiation of Profane, Prohibited, and Prescribed Speech. I want to talk about that, but first I thought maybe we should talk about what we mean by ethnography and ethnography of communication. Can we start with that?
Absolutely.
Sure.
Ethnography of communication is what all of my research is based in. It's an approach to studying culture, actually. Mm-hmm. And when you think about culture, you can come at it from a variety of ways, right? We could look at our political systems, our economic systems, art, religion. We happen to focus on communication. And ultimately, I'm looking at how does culture get revealed through everyday talk. That's what ethnography of communication is, and it takes ethnographic approaches to do that. So listening to people in their everyday contexts, not putting them necessarily in laboratories, and listening to them that way, although that's also a great way to study communication. But we interview people, we listen to them in their everyday contexts, and look for cultural patterns in everyday talk.
Okay, and I recall reading, someone said that all study of culture is a study of communication, because if something isn't communicated, then it can't be part of the culture. What do you think of that definition?
Well, there is the old saying, you cannot not communicate, right? And so I think communication is ultimately at the heart of everything. One of the ways that we kind of go about it is we're very interested also in meta-communication, which is basically talk about talk, or communication about communication. Right. So we sort of focus in on, what are those ways, what are the sequences and interaction that reveal themselves? What are the meanings between people when they are speaking? How are they shared? How are they culturally significant? These are all questions that fascinate us as ethnographers of communication.
And we have rules, don't we? There's sort of tacit rules that we follow when we're communicating with one another.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so we actually see culture not as, one can be a member of a cultural group, but for us, culture is a way of, it's really a system. If you think about the symbols that we share, which are oftentimes words, although they can be other things, right. We come to understand particular meanings around those symbols. We share rules, right? When is it appropriate to say particular things, in what context, under what circumstances, right? Yeah. And when is it inappropriate? We do a lot with meaning and the creation of meaning. That's at the heart of what we do. So implicit and explicit rules, they're very interesting to us when we communicate.
Yeah, when this comes up in my lectures, I use this example of a friend of mine. We used to have this discussion group at my house. We'd read books and we'd debate them, and people would get, it'd be late at night and they'd get a little animated. And this friend was visiting from Cincinnati, and he couldn't get a word in edgewise. And so out of frustration, he started to say something, and then he got interrupted by somebody else, one of the regulars. And he said, wait a second. He said, where I come from, if you get 3 words in, then you have the floor. And he told us it was the Cincinnati Rule, right? So he was actually referring to a cultural norm in Cincinnati, or at least in his household in Cincinnati,
Absolutely.
Right? And trying to impose that on the Chicago area conversation that was going on, right?
Yeah. Overlap, is it overlap or is it interruption? That's a very regional and that's a very cultural understanding of communication. And so if I overlap with the end of your sentence because I think I know what's coming, You know, I come from the East Coast. That's something that I do a lot. But some people treat it as an interruption and stop. So those are cultural understandings of communication that we sometimes share and sometimes don't, and they can cause, you know, a bit of conflict, like over books and how do we discuss this. So.
Yeah, I come from a Greek American family, and if you don't interrupt somebody, they think you're not paying attention.
Right.
You know, it's just it's
Absolutely.
built into the system, right? So if when he brought that up though. His name was Paul, when he said, you know, in Cincinnati, you get 3 words and you have the floor. That was taking us to a meta discussion then, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
So let's talk about that. So how often are we really engaging in meta discussions about how we're going to discuss things?
Well, meta communication actually plays a very, very big role. And, you know, you can kind of see it in even the names we give to certain types of talk. So we call them terms for talk. And those are culturally very significant too. For example, brown nosing. There have been people who have studied brown nosing as a particular way of communicating.
I don't know if I'd want that on my resume.
Right, absolutely, but it's fascinating. And I have also studied a term for talk in German called Yaman, or in English, the closest is to yammer or whine. And so these terms, when people hear them, they have a very good understanding of when is this appropriate, when is it not appropriate, who gets to play this game interactionally. And they will call you out if you're not playing the game appropriately, and that takes cultural knowledge, and that's something that many of us share. So we show membership by that as well in particular cultural groups.
So this term, Yaman, am I saying that right?
Yaman.
Spelled with a J?
Uh-huh.
Yes. It means to whine about something.
Exactly.
But it's acceptable all over in German culture, or
well,
certain
you know, I
aspects of
think it's actually, it shows up in many languages and many cultural groups. I happened to pay attention to it because I was living in Germany, and I was sort of noticing this tendency of people to, I think in the US we want to exude positivity often and exude that we are doing really well, and that wasn't necessarily the way people were interacting in Germany, and I had other friends who would comment on it. And so I started to look at it, and it became very interesting in 2006 because the World Cup was going on at the time in Germany, and they had actually come together to form a public service announcement called Du bist Deutschland, which is basically a way to say to the Germans, who were at the time in kind of an economic downfall, as the rest of us were, saying, hey, roll up your sleeves, stop whining, start doing something for your country. And they spent 30 million euros on this particular public service announcement, and many people took part in it. And it was, to some extent, it did well, but many Germans said, you know, please, this is not something that we want to watch on TV and be told to do. So Yaman for them it's kind of it's a way of communicating that's very culturally significant to some folks, and it does well. And it can be contrasted to something like meckern, or to complain. And in English, it's the same way. To complain, you usually are doing sort of an outward. Complaining about something you want changed, something you're unhappy about, and you'd like to either change it yourself or have somebody else do something about it. With Yaman, it's much more inward. It's talking about your own emotional play, your own physical play. In some way, you're trying to evoke sympathy, empathy, some sort of solidarity with your plight. So these have social functions, these ways of speaking, that are also very culturally important.
I think that's a common practice amongst sports fans in Chicago as well. It's infiltrated us.
Very good, yes.
Especially this year. How did you go about researching that? I mean, because you've written about this, right? How do you research it? How do you
I was lucky enough. I mean, I am an ethnographer. An ethnographer usually has to go to the place and study the people as they're interacting in the places they interact. And so I was lucky enough to get a grant, and I went over to Germany, and I did interviews with people that are much like this, very conversational, and allow them to kind of tell me what's important to them. That's kind of what I follow. So ethnography at its heart is trying to get out, what do the participants find interesting? What do they find meaningful, rather than what I as a researcher find meaningful?
So accounting research, where you ask someone why they say what they say, or?
Absolutely, that, but also field work. So going into the streets, going to parties, going to various events, and listening to people, and taking notes. And taking
So you go to a
notes.
restaurant and say, could you sit me next to that couple over there that seems to be arguing with one another?
You'd be surprised. surprised at how
Yeah.
much whining happens in public. It happens quite a bit. So that was
sure it does.
enjoyable. That was very enjoyable for me.
In fact, I think in one of your articles you listed 4 categories of ways that you can research this, I think, right? Was it?
Yeah, that was, I'm very interested in, as a foreign language speaker, so I'm not a German native speaker. I
Right.
learned it in school. And
I was going to say, your English is very good if you studied
no,
German. Okay.
I learned it in school. I went over there. I lived for 7 years and studied in Germany, but I'm not a native speaker. And so, and then there are many people, right, who study in other countries and study through other languages. But when you're focused on communication, what happens as an ethnographer when you're trying to understand their discourse and they're speaking to you as a foreigner? That changes the data that you're collecting. So I have some publications about that. How does it change when you're interviewing somebody? How does it change when you're taking notes? And you're actually a part of that. I mean, we know the observer effect, right? When you are observing something, you're going to change the scene that you're in.
Right.
But what happens when you actually change the discourse that you're collecting because of your foreigners?
Because you're talking.
Yeah.
And they just know you're there. So, and then also there's a research side to this too. I suppose you could study this by looking at novels or.
Absolutely. There's so much now in the
News
media.
stories.
I can look in news stories. I can collect, and I did quite a bit of that for my Yaman research. So I looked at how are people reacting to this? What are some of the op-ed pieces about this Du bist Deutschland campaign? Is it something that people believe in and think is a good idea or not? So I collect quite a bit of information that way too.
Yeah. I do some media research sometimes, and one of the things that I was tracking for a while was how political candidates, maybe public relations people, will negotiate with news media on how they should cover the story.
Interesting.
George Bush, for instance, when he was running for president the first time, was being connected to the Iran-Contra scandal, and he did a live interview with Dan Rather, and Rather started asking me about the scandal, and Bush said, why are we talking about that? That's not news, it's old news. And he defined what he thought news coverage should be for Rather, and Rather was just flummoxed. He didn't know, he didn't know what to say. It was an interesting interview.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a publication that's coming out very soon that my co-authors and I were sort of looking at policing the boundaries of speech, sort of what is proscribed speech, what is prohibited speech.
Right.
And what we found is with so many controversial topics, say race relations or immigration, we're often not arguing about the issue itself. We end up actually arguing about what may be said about that issue or what may not be said about that issue and how should it be said.
Yeah.
So we're actually doing a lot of meta-communicating about the issue and sometimes get stuck there. And so if you look at some of the recent just political talk that's out there in the scenes, it's oftentimes what you're going to hear are people saying, well, that was offensive to me, or that shouldn't have been said, versus, well, we should have free speech, we should be able to say anything at all. And so, who's right, who's wrong? Well, ultimately, it's really a discussion about communication. It's not a discussion about whether we should keep talking about race relations and that would help anything. It's really about the communication about race relations or the communication about immigration that we get stuck on.
Yeah, that expression, you people, is a cliche now, and you see it in scripts all the time when they have, people of different ethnic backgrounds, and one says to the other, well, you people, and the audience knows right away that the conversation is about to stop.
Right.
And they're going to start negotiating how they're talking about this.
Ultimately, with just that phrase, you're saying, I am a member over here, and you are not a member, right? And you're showing affiliation or disaffiliation. We do that all the time.
Yeah. So let's just look at this title here for this article, because this fascinates me. Policing the boundaries of the sayable. So if I can go through this a little bit at a time.
Sure.
So when you say the sayable, in other words, what's acceptable to say in certain situations.
Absolutely.
Right? And then the public negotiation of the profane, the prohibited, and proscribed speech. So let's look at the profane and prohibited speech for a second here. It seems to me that has that category has shifted a lot in terms of public communication in my lifetime, in the U.S. at least. Do you track any of that, or are you looking at this more at the level of small people, small groups, and people talking one-on-one.
Well, this particular publication was looking at some case studies, various
Sure.
case studies. The one that I looked at happened at DePaul University, and we had a speaker come in, and that particular speaker was, for some, celebrated, and for others, caused protests.
Okay.
And so the question then became, is speech and action, are they the same? And the speaker was saying, you know what, speech doesn't hurt anybody. Speech is not violent. I should be allowed to say whatever I want to say. And you should train your students and you should train yourselves to be able to listen to that. And there's merit to that. But there were many who said, no, what you're saying is very hurtful. It's hurting marginalized groups, it's hurting various people, and it's violent. And we have to see those two things, speech and action, as the same. You are committing something when you speak in that way. Ultimately, again, topics kind of went to the wayside because what was happening was the argument was about whether or not speech should occur, or this particular type of speech should occur or not on a campus.
So
and that's across the nation.
Right?
We've got that argument going on across the nation about kind of free speech, hate speech, those kind of words coming out, trying to figure out what are the definitions of those and what should we allow at our universities.
And that was, of course, always an issue with the free speech movement.
Yes.
Lenny Bruce was an advocate for that. And it seems to me it changed a lot in the 60s. In fact, I saw a TV show the other day, and they were just, openly talking about sexual situations and things, and I thought, that never would have aired 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
So our cultural knowledge, our cultural expectations of what's permitted and what's not permitted, what's okay to say on TV at a particular hour, when it was relegated to later in the evening, now maybe it's coming earlier. That's interesting, and we're seeing a cultural shift, but it also has to do with our communication, right? It's not just a cultural shift in media, but it's our communication in media and on media that ends up shifting and changing, which is to be expected, of course. But you've got to share that cultural knowledge, and you've got to share those cultural belief systems in order to kind of play along, or you're going to have disagreement, which is also fine.
Yeah. It seems like, you mentioned Lenny Bruce, that comedians are kind of testing those boundaries. You can almost say that that's a standard theme for all comedians, is to push those boundaries and get reactions from audiences.
Absolutely. In fact, I'm actually working on a piece right now that's looking at the Michael Richards episode. This happened quite a few years ago, where he was in Los Angeles and doing a comedy routine, and then unfortunately said the N-word many times.
Oh, he
on
went
stage.
off on a couple in the audience,
he
right?
He did. He went off on.
It kind of ended his career, didn't it?
It did end his career.
Yeah.
And it's
justifiably so, I would say, from what I understand about it.
And if you look at how he talks about what happened, despite saying the N-word a good, I think, 7 times, he said, "I am not a racist." And so, how do you come to an understanding of somebody who can do that on stage? And he would say, "Well, it took me over." It's almost the way he talks about it. It took me over. The rage. It was never my rage. It was always the rage. And so it came in and just possessed him, exactly. And so it's just, even at the micro level, when you look at how people talk, to say the rage rather than my rage, that's saying, I'm not a part of this. This is not me. I am not a racist.
Yeah, most people aren't going to say, "Oh yeah, you caught me, I'm a racist." Right. Yeah.
Right. One would normally do that, yes. Yeah. So, comedians are pushing the boundaries, but they're also getting, I hear them say all the time, they can't say certain things on stage anymore. And so what becomes
they think it's shifting
funny,
the other way?
Right. Many do. They think that being offensive is just not permitted anymore. They can't push the boundaries the way they used to. And so if you think about policing speech, who is saying what's allowed and what's not allowed? If that's your career as a comedian, you should ultimately be able to say whatever.
Yeah.
That's how they feel, but I would say most audience members wouldn't agree.
And then, of course, there's the differences between different subcultures within larger cultures, right?
Absolutely.
An interesting example of that happened, I guess it's been about 15, 20 years ago, but we had a candidate who was interviewing for a job here, and he was a journalist interviewing to teach journalism. And we asked him about diversity. And the standard answer to that question, if you're a journalist, is I treat everybody the same, right? That's the wrong answer at the university.
Yes, it is.
And so he said that, and the minute he said it, I put my head down, and they, the faculty grilled him on it, and he kept giving them wrong answers. But from a, if you're a member of the profession of a journalist, at least maybe that's evolved in a lot of ways. But they're so focused on being objective that the obvious answer to that question is the answer he gave.
Well, but that shows a bit of, or a lack of cultural knowledge, right? So how we talk about race and how we talk about diversity and the term individual, treat everybody like an individual.
Yeah.
Well, what does that actually mean? That's changed and shifted over time, or we're all just human beings.
Yeah.
We know that's a taboo, especially in the academy. We know that's a taboo
because
statement.
it perpetuates the problems,
Absolutely.
right? Yeah.
But if you're not part of that cultural group and you haven't been part of those cultural conversations, sometimes I think it's, I don't want to say this for the journalist who came to interview with you,
well,
but
it's
long access,
gone,
right?
He didn't come back.
Sometimes it's about access to these conversations and understanding, if I think about my parents and being older and not having access to certain conversations, I think we have to also kind of look at it from that standpoint before judging,
Yeah.
And ultimately, as an ethnographer of communication, kind of formulating what are the appropriate ways to talk about this topic. That's kind of exciting, and it helps people.
Yeah.
It helps people.
And he was interviewing for a job at a university, so
Absolutely. He should have known.
shame on
right?
him for not knowing better.
Exactly.
Of course, the appropriate answer to that is, we celebrate diversity, we encourage diversity, et cetera, et cetera. But it seems to me that that journalism has changed a lot over the last 20 years, and they're less, journalists are less likely to claim they're being strictly objective. They understand that really all human expression is kind of ethnographic, right, in a way, wouldn't you say?
Well, we saw that in the social sciences as well, right?
Yeah.
It used to be stay objective, stay out of it, don't even say I. And then over time, the way we've written articles, we're very reflective about who we are in the scene and how we're changing what we're studying.
Yeah.
So,
well, and that's another part of the meta discourse, right? Is we're now
Absolutely.
saying that it's okay to put yourself in the story.
well, you are in the story, so at least call it out, show how that might affect it, acknowledge it, and then try to do your study.
So as someone who teaches at a university, if you're talking about politics, do you try to take a neutral stand on everything, or do you acknowledge your biases so that the class knows where you're coming from? Which do you recommend?
Well,
we've debated that a lot in my department.
Actually, it's very much based in the ethnography of communication as a field. What I'm trying to do is understand what's important to people, how they speak, and what are the cultural belief systems that underlie how they speak. So is it for me necessarily to come down on one side or the other? Of course I have personal preferences, politically and otherwise, but I'm not sure it's necessarily my job, because if I start to critique the cultures I'm looking at, then I stop understanding them in their own terms.
Right.
And so it's important for me to look at a cultural group and to try and understand what's important to those members, even if I disagree with it, to at least be able to formulate that and to analyze it.
But to some extent to acknowledge also some of your own background, like when you're writing about German culture, right?
Absolutely, and my students often know where I stand. I don't, I try not to, I try to let them know also, wherever I stand or wherever you've gotten out of my teaching here, it doesn't matter. As long as you make good arguments that are based on evidence, that are convincing, that's important to me, and that you're able to do that. So it doesn't much matter ultimately what side you come down on politically, for me, not in the classroom at least.
Yeah. Well, so when you teach this, do you give the students little projects to, do you give them a little methodology to go try on their friends?
Absolutely. We learn different lenses, different frameworks to listen to conversation. I mean, to me, we're such a visual society. And to me, this is a way of listening for culture. That's how I sell it. And so if you can go into your new workplace as a young person and listen to the cultural groups around you and how they're speaking and what keywords are important to them and what meanings are, it's empowering to listen and to try and figure that out and then align yourself or not, depending,
Sure.
It's a pretty powerful tool. And so I try to sell it as this is empowering to you. You've got to learn to listen differently and listen for culture, not just assume you know it walking in.
So you're not just picking up the habits of speaking that the group has, but you're also reading something into their philosophy, their beliefs, their common
Absolutely. There are
understandings.
particular belief systems that underlie everything that we say, right? It's coming out. Culture is revealing itself every minute we speak. So how do you learn to listen for that and then formulate it and make distinctions between the groups that you're working with or living with? Once you can do that, it's pretty exciting, to me at least.
So how'd you get into this?
Oh gosh, you know, when I went over to Germany, I was interested in intercultural misunderstandings. That's what I wanted to study, and they didn't really have intercultural communication at the time there.
Yeah.
So I had to kind of find my way, and then ultimately ended up going to the University of Washington, where I studied with Jerry Phillipson, who's sort of the father of this area in communication. So.
Okay, very good. That's all the time we have for our program. I want to thank Michaela for joining us today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.